You know how this goes. I'm a YouTuber, a somewhat public figure, and of course I own a camera. I have just shown you some beautiful shots, either ones I captured myself or grabbed from the internet, to make my story more convincing. And you are an amateur who loves camera gear. Perfect match, right? And as luck would have it, I've got an offer you just can't refuse. A super duper LUT pack for the low price of just $29.99, guaranteed to transform your footage into art. Yeah, no. LUTs are a scam. Every time I see a YouTuber pushing their own LUT pack, a little part of me dies inside. It's like an epidemic in the popular side of the photography and filmmaking space on YouTube. If you don't know me, I'm a photographer, a scientist, and the owner of a big scenographic studio in Poland. But more than anything, I love educating people. And today we are talking about exposure. Just the basics really, because mastering it is no joke. The top professionals in post-production, color grading and high-end filmmaking are not just talented, they are highly technical and well-educated in their craft. Nevertheless, I've noticed that even experienced solo creators tend to develop bad habits. And a lot of that comes from misleading or oversimplified educational content floating around the internet. Exposure is a tricky thing to master, because truly understanding it means being skilled in multiple areas, many of which, in professional world, are handled by entirely different specialists. A color grading specialist isn't the one capturing raw footage, but they can assess its quality and instantly recognize mistakes made during filming just by looking at the material. And here's something a lot of people don't think about. Post-production teams prepare masters differently for mobile screens and cinema, using different exposures, gamma curves, black levels and more. There's also a surprising amount of math hiding behind what we casually call good exposure. When amateurs talk about exposure, they usually think in terms of the exposure triangle. And honestly, that makes sense. Beginners tend to approach it from a camera settings perspective. Plus, if you are a one-person crew, you don't exactly have time to micromanage every aspect of exposure. One of the biggest beginner mistakes in videography is thinking that exposure is something you just set in the camera. In reality, exposure is determined by how much light is hitting your sensor across different parts of your scene, and it's your job to manage that properly. You can either tweak your camera's parameters or you can control the scene itself. A lot of people also misunderstand ISO in professional cameras. I covered that in another video, so check it out if you haven't already, it's worth your time. If you want consistent, well-exposed images, you need to learn the fundamentals of lighting. Control and minimize the dynamic range of your scene, handle specular highlights and prevent blown-out spots, properly fill shadows to avoid crushed blacks, and set an appropriate contrast ratio for your subjects. And in video, contrast ratio is a huge deal. You need to know how it works in both bright outdoor scenes and low light environments, because no matter how much you tweak your camera settings, these things cannot be fixed in camera. And of course, I understand that there are some jobs where you have no way of controlling the environment, but I also know that more often than not, it's just a lack of knowledge. At my studio here, we have sometimes 50 people on set, and sometimes there are productions with 3-people crew. Honestly, we have an entire arsenal of lighting equipment at your disposal, yet people still try to shoot without proper lighting, even though setting up 2 softboxes takes almost no effort and makes a huge difference. It's not just about setting up your scene properly. There's also a huge misunderstanding about how to expose when using log footage correctly. Log formats have become super popular for capturing a wider dynamic range in a standard, highly compressed formats like H.264. They use a transformation curve to squeeze more information into the file, and then the proper inverse transformation brings everything back to a standard color range. Because of in-camera optimizations, noise reductions and compression algorithms, log footage typically has lower noise levels than raw video formats. So what happens after someone buys the first camera capable of raw recording? Let's say a Blackmagic Pocket camera. They are shocked to see how noisy their footage is, even though they expected higher quality. But somehow this isn't a problem in professional work. In fact, RAW footage is the standard for high-end productions, and even RE RAW contains a fair amount of inherent noise. The point is that noise is not usually the problem for pros. Some of them even will add noise in post. And here we can see YouTube is teaching people how to expose log footage to reduce noise in the format that is known to have little to no noise. And the solution they offer is overexposing the image. Let's be clear, this is not some magical trick to eliminate noise. All you are doing by overexposing the log footage is shifting your dynamic range, pushing more of your information into the midtones and shadows while sacrificing highlight detail. In many cases, this can completely ruin the look of your scene. And here's where it gets even worse. Most amateur gear doesn't let you adjust your monitoring exposure levels. So if you are overexposing log footage, what you are seeing on set is an overexposed image. In a real production, this alone is enough to get you fired on the spot. No serious director of photography would accept an operator monitoring an overblown image. It's just a bad practice. Period. Your goal when setting exposure is simple. Make your monitoring image as close to the final result as possible. That's the only way to properly judge if your scene is lit correctly and if you are capturing solid material for post-production. Overexposing just to clean up noise in the shadows? That's not a good enough reason to compromise your entire preview image. But let's be real, this isn't a widespread issue in the professional world. And honestly, modern log formats are incredibly clean, even when slightly underexposed. Plenty of productions intentionally underexpose their image just to get a proper preview. Anyone who actually works in video production quickly learns that monitoring an image that's 2 stops overexposed is just not practical. It looks like garbage. Setting exposure as close to the final result as possible isn't some rigid rule by any means, but it's a widely accepted standard in both videography and photography. It just makes sense. Our eyes don't perceive brightness in a linear way, and exposure adjustments can have a massive impact on how an image feels, not just how it looks. In photography, things are a bit different. You have strobes that gives you abundance of power output. You always work with raw material, and you can even apply pre-production grading in tethered workflows. But the core idea remains the same. You want your preview to match what you are actually going for. Remember that simple EV calculations based on ISO, shutter speed and aperture are absolute values, but most modern cameras display relative EV readings, typically referenced to a middle gray card. But in video, tools like false colors and waveform monitors give a much better understanding of exposure across different parts of a scene. In real-world scenes, middle gray often isn't relevant at all. First off, there might be a case that no subject in the scene is actually similar to middle gray. Then what actually matters is the exposure of elements that are crucial for human perception, like skin tones, highlights from motivated light sources, or shadows levels that define depth and atmosphere. That's why simply exposing a scene based on middle gray values can lead to overly bright, unnatural images, especially if you are shooting a dark, moody scene where most details should remain in the shadows. Additionally, the problem is that human vision isn't uniform across all exposure levels. Our natural vision is fundamentally different from how a camera captures light. Our eyes don't perceive brightness in a linear manner. We have something similar to an adaptive log curve built into our brains, and it's not static. It changes dynamically based on ambient light levels and environmental conditions. Just think about how your night vision adjusts when you step into a dark room. Evolution also shaped our visual perception in interesting ways. We have higher sensitivity in shadows than in highlights, because our ancestors needed to spot threats lurking in the dark. Our brains are also really good at reconstructing details in deep blacks, which is why we don't perceive darkness as a simple void, but rather a space where subtle details emerge over over time, and sometimes our imagination can even spot the details that are not really there in the scene. This is also directly tied to how we emotionally perceive images. Lighting and exposure define whether an image feels moody, eerie, warm, or inviting. If you take a naturally dark scene like a dimly lit room with a few lamps and overexpose it by just a couple of stops, it feels wrong. The math behind the lighting might still check out, but the contrast balance gets thrown off relative to how our brains expect to see this kind of scene. And there is also the huge gap between reality and how images are displayed by modern technology. Our eyes can perceive a dynamic range of about 20 plus EV stops, but a typical computer monitor or cinema projector only shows 7 to 8 stops. That means we are always working within a compressed and processed version of reality. Even tiny exposure shift can have a massive impact on mood and perception, because our brains are interpreting contrast and tones, not just absolute brightness. And then there's the reality. Most people don't calibrate their monitors or TVs. Everyone's screen has its own contrast ratios, gamma curves, and brightness levels. Even something as simple as turning up the backlight on a LED screen can artificially boost exposure in a way that wasn't intended by the director. That's why mastering an image in post is such a balancing act. It's not about making an image look perfect in one controlled environment. It's about making it look good across a huge range of viewing conditions. And with smartphones, HDR, different screen technologies, and varying display settings, that challenge is bigger than ever. There's no single correct way to do it. It's always about optimizing for the best possible experience across as many screens as possible. So I've been talking about all these different aspects of exposure just to show how much actually goes into it. And now let's bring it back to LUTs. An LUT is a transformation, and it can adjust contrast, compress colors, and even warp the color space in specific ways. Most LUTs are handcrafted by someone who graded a single image, or maybe a few similar ones, to make them look more visually appealing. The problem? That LUT was built around a specific exposure, a specific color balance, and a specific tonal range. So if your footage doesn't match that original reference, the LUT is probably going to break your image rather than enhance it. And let's be real, if you ever bought one of those cinematic LUT packs from big YouTubers, you've probably had this experience. You cycle through dozens of LUTs hoping to find one that kinda sorta works, and even when you do, the results rarely match what was advertised. That's because LUTs aren't smart. They don't adjust dynamically. They adjust a switch that applies a fixed transformation, whether it fits your footage or not. Aside from technical issues with LUTs being one of the worst ways to color grade your footage, there's a broader topic of proper color grading itself. Real professional color grading isn't about drastically shifting things or slapping on some preset filters. It's about carefully limiting, compressing, and adjusting certain parts of the existing color gamut in your image. A good color grade begins long before you hit record. It starts with the set design, with the colors and lighting you choose for the scene. No professional in post-production wants to add colors that weren't there in the first place. If you look at raw footage from even low-budget commercial shoots, you will notice that it already looks pretty solid. On the flip side though, I get that there are more and more tools out there trying to make the grading process easier for amateurs, offering one-click cinematic looks. While these may not always work perfectly right off the bat, they do give you a bunch of parameters you can tweak. This is much better quick fix solution than LUTs, and some of them are being implemented as a standard in video editing software, as for instance Film Look Creator in DaVinci Resolve. LUTs can be a bit like a magical quick fix that almost never actually delivers the goods. And sure, if you've got thousands of them to choose from, your chances of finding one that looks halfway decent go up. But even then, it's not the best approach. The exceptions are LUTs that tend to simulate more physical transformation, as for instance a stock film simulation LUTs. They are usually based on well-known color compression curves and covers wide color gamut, limiting chances of destroying your image color space. You can also find very decent LUTs already already present in your editing software, so you don't need to additionally pay for it. The smarter way to go is to invest in the right education or tools, like taking some color grading workshops. The thing is, it's not always about nailing the perfect color grade from the get-go. Only a handful of pros can do that. It's more about learning to spot the subtle issues that come with applying LUTs. Of course, there's the elephant in the room. Some of you might have bought LUTs from your favorite creators just to support them, and that's totally awesome. No judgment here, it's a fair trade. But knowledge is power, and while LUTs might seem like a quick solution, they can also give you this false impression that this is a way to go in professional video and photo production. To be precise, settings packs for raw editors and NLEs, those are actually pretty great for learning. You get to see exactly which tools and parameters were used to achieve a certain look, and that's super helpful. But LUTs don't give you that inside. They do their thing, but you have no real control or understanding of what's going on inside. Alright, I will wrap it here. Just to clarify, even though I work in the industry, I'm not doing any professional post-production work. So don't worry, I am not trying to sell you any courses on that topic. But I do have a proper knowledge about skills in cinematic lighting for both video and photo. And honestly, this area of content creation is way more important than any post-production work. I cannot stress enough how valuable it is to learn more about lighting. It's a game changer for your image quality. I've been running cinematic lighting workshops in my studio for a few years now, and I must say that even just diving into this topic can seriously level up your work. In the coming months, I will be putting parts of my physical workshops into an online course, and I will make it available for free. So if you want to improve your skills, make sure to stay subscribed or sign up for my newsletter. Links are in the description. See you in the next video.